Well, hello. Tonight we are discussing in Bible study the Genesis story of Noah, which is found in Genesis chapter 6 through 9. We've already started a pretty interesting discussion. I'm going to catch you up a little bit at it right now while folks are in small groups. We talked to begin about the variety of ways that folks remember this story, which, if we're honest, most often is a story of some cute animals that we might plaster in a nursery and read in rhyme form from a children's book. I think those who have been reading the Noah story or read it this week, chapter 6 through 9, will realize that it's actually not as cute and cuddly as we often remember. And so some of the things that we discussed going into this, besides recognizing that the story has some really troubling details that are easy to forget, we talked a little bit about the Nephilim, these mythical creatures, this idea in Genesis that there were beings, heavenly beings, who came down and had children with human women. And we talked a little bit about how that's portrayed in Genesis. The Genesis text is a little ambiguous. It, on the one hand, calls the Nephilim heroes, which would seem positive. On the other hand, it places it right at the beginning of the flood story, right before God decides to destroy humankind for wickedness. And so there's also a possibility that it could be a negative thing as well. One of the troubling things with the Noah story, especially if we're reading it historically, or literally, is that the Nephilim, which we would suspect were destroyed in the flood along with everyone and everything else that was not on the ark, actually make another appearance in the book of Numbers, in chapter 13, where the Hebrew scouts find Nephilim, which we would assume had been destroyed in the flood and their line had been destroyed, and yet here they are. There's also suggestions that Goliath might be considered in the Hebrew scriptures to be from these same ancient beings. Again, which is troubling if you're reading the Noah story as a historical event, because it would suggest that they would have already been gone. We also talked a little bit about how that same problem comes up from the genealogies in chapter 4 of Genesis, which suggests that there are certain people who are ancestors, the ancestors of artisans who come later on. And yet we get to chapter 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 of Genesis, and all of those individuals' families would have been destroyed in the flood, which means either Noah carried on all trades, or again, there's this challenging piece of, were all the people destroyed in the flood, or were they not? What do the authors of Genesis actually think about that? We also talked a little bit about, and what folks are discussing right now, is whether they think this story is historical, or if it's metaphorical, or something else. One of the challenges of the text, and I think it's exhibited well by this the Noah Museum that was built in Kentucky, is, did Noah by himself or with his 3 sons build this gigantic ark? The museum, which is modeled after the ark in Kentucky, or at least the Bible's dimensions, cost $100 million. It took a number of years for over 1,000 people to build it, which I think is a challenge. I know it's supposed to prove that it's historical, but I feel like that's it maybe doesn't prove that 1 to 4 people built a boat with no tools, no modern tools, that would cost $100 million and take over 1,000 people to build. Also noted that there are other ancient flood stories from other ancient civilizations, although it's also important to note that not all of those flood stories are exactly like the one in the Hebrew Scriptures. The Hebrew Scriptures, the Noah story, has a different perspective on why God might send the flood. It also has different understandings about divinity, and so while there's some similarities, it's not so simple to just say, well, these are just all the same, because they're really not. And so what we're getting ready to talk about now, what we're going to head into next, is we're going to talk about what I think is a really difficult and challenging and troubling part of the text, which is the idea that God regrets creating especially humankind. So that's what we're going to talk about next as I bring people back, but I'm glad you're watching here on Facebook. All right. I'd like to regather you a little bit. I hope you continue to have some really good discussions, really interesting discussions. So one of the really challenging parts of this story that I want to talk about next is at the beginning of the story, it talks about that the text tells us that God regrets creation. God regrets especially creating humankind. I think for most of us, that is not the most comforting thought. Right? That's a challenging part of this text. And the same idea is going to the idea that the NRSV says, the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. That is a strong statement. There are going to be other times in the Bible, especially as we go through the Torah in the beginning of the Bible, there are going to be other times where God has conversations and God says, I think I'm just going to end them. I'm just going to wipe them out. And we have like Abraham arguing with God. We have Moses arguing with God. But this is the first instance where God says something like that, and it's a hard one. It's a strong statement. There's a huge fall somewhere in the first few chapters of the Bible from humanity and humankind as the crown of creation, the very last thing created, the jewel, creatures made in the image of God, the only creatures made in the image of God, to this. To God saying, for the text saying, it grieved God to the heart that God decided to create humans. That's a rough one. It's a rough story. The other challenge in this very same section is that the author suggests that God is not omniscient, that God's not all-knowing. I think that's the suggestion in this text. God creates human beings. A few chapters later, God's like, this was a terrible mistake. I should not have done this. We're going to talk a little bit more about the sources, the narrative sources. We've been talking about this through Genesis. The two different strains, the J source, the Yahweh source we've been talking about, and also the priestly source, these two separate narratives that have been brought together in the beginning of Genesis. We've talked about that. You might remember that from previous Bible studies. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But it's worth noting that this beginning of chapter 6 is from the J source, the Yahweh source. And one of the things that is interesting about that, and we've seen this throughout, and I'm going to suggest it again, this J source presents God as a much more human-like character than does the priestly source. So we notice this in the creation story. We had the priestly source where God is creating out in the cosmos of the universe. But then we get to the J source where the second creation story, and we get a different picture. God is digging in the dirt, right? Creating the man from dirt, breathing into the man. Very different from this God who's taming chaos and creating from the cosmos and creates humankind. It's much more hands-on. It's this much more human-like depiction of God. We have God walking in the garden, which is a human action of walking. And we also get this picture of God being heartbroken, which is certainly not this untouchable, distant kind of God who's grieved to the heart. That is much more of a human characteristic than a distant God who is unaffected by humanity. And so this comes from the J source, this idea of God being grieved to the heart, of this picture of God regretting creating humans. We also see that there's some different motivations for God's regret and ultimately for the flood. In the J source, the second creation story source, God is motivated by the evil in human hearts. We get God thinking about there's evil in the human hearts and it's always there. And so that's becomes the main reason in the J source why God says I have to get rid of them. The priestly source has a slightly different presentation on this. In the priestly source, God says to Noah, "I have determined to make an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I'm going to destroy humankind along with the earth." So on the one hand, it was like they always have these evil thoughts in their hearts. That was the J source. In the priestly source, it's the violence. God can't take the violence. And so that's the reason for the flood. I would say the priestly source presents then this extreme plan to end violence. I think we can admit that it's a pretty extreme plan to end violence, wipe everybody out. But we remember that violence has been introduced in the story very early. I mean, after Adam and Eve, we have, they start having children, and then violence starts. And we see that through the genealogy, where there's little songs about killing. And we start to get, it's pretty early in the Bible that the human story introduces violence. In the priestly source, which suggests God can't handle that violence. God's not interested in our violence. So this regret that God shows in Genesis then leads to the unraveling of creation in the priestly story. And so we see the waters, which we remember at the beginning, there was the great deep, and God, that was the first thing God tamed, was the chaos of the waters. The first thing. Well, God was holding them back, but now we see as creation starts to unravel, the first thing that God does is let's go. And the waters start to move again. And what we get, according to the text, it doesn't say, and it just rained. It says, the great deep burst forth. So we remember that. There was the great deep. The Spirit floated over the great deep. So the great deep, these waters under the earth, God lets them have at it again. So in the first creation story, God was separating water from the earth and putting bounds around the water and pushing it, and letting dry land emerge. And all of a sudden, all of that God had done, God lets go, and that starts to come. And then the text says, in addition to that, the windows of heaven were open. And so we got in the first chapter, we got this idea that there was a dome over the earth. Remember, this isn't a science book, right? But there was this dome over the earth, and that was holding the waters. And then so God opens windows in the dome, and the waters, all this chaos, the watery chaos, comes from above and below. So creation is unraveling. Everything on earth save the ark and the contents of the ark dies in the story. Opposite of creation. First God was making and giving life, and now life is taken away. The end of the story becomes a restart of creation in a certain sense, because after the flood lands dry and the animals go, and God's talking again to the creatures and says the same thing that God says in Genesis chapter 1. Be fruitful and multiply. Same thing. Restart of creation. We have these two stories. This is one of the questions. Is this story a combination of the literary sources? And the answer is yes. And there's going to be a couple of things that probably came up in your reading that will be explained by the two sources instead of it being one unified source. Unlike the creation stories, however, in the Noah story, the two traditions, J and priestly source, the creation story was the priestly source, and it goes to verse 2:4, beginning of verse 2:4, and then it starts the second creation story. In the Noah story, the two stories are mixed together. It's the same sources, but there's more of an intentional weaving of the stories. So if you look, of course, one of the ways we've been using for evidence of how we check the two sources is by looking at the names of God, right? So in the priestly source, it's big G, little o, little d. And in the Yahweh source, the J source, it's capital L-O-R-D, capital Lord, right? So the two authors, the two traditions use different names for God. We can see that in the English text. It's more obvious, of course, in the Hebrew, but even in our English texts, we see it. So how we can tell that these sources are mixed together. So in the beginning, in chapter 6, the first 8 verses are by the J source. So you'll look and it'll say the Lord, right? You see that? And then starting in chapter 6, verses 9 through 22, it's the priestly source. And then from then on, at that point, all the references to God just say God. But then at the beginning of chapter 7, it goes back to the Lord. Right? So these two are mixed together. That's one of the ways we can see this. I would suggest that the more obvious way to recognize the two strains is that there are some obvious differences in the number of animals. And they are like right beside each other. There's not even books separating this. There are just words. A couple of words separate two different instructions that Noah gets on the number of animals that he's instructed to put in the ark, right? So did anybody notice this? Right. So at the end of chapter 6, God tells Noah to take 2 of every kind of animal. One male, one female, so they can breed, right? 2 of every animal. A few verses later. And that's the more common remembrance. So if you look at a kid's book, they're going to say, there are two by two. Like, all the animals came into the ark in pairs, right? And they have them lining up, and there's like 2 bears and like 2 lions, right? And they're all walking in the ark together in like a big line. And there's 2 of each. So that's the more common remembrance. And so, but that's not what chapter 7 says. So in chapter 7, we get different instructions, and it's just a couple of verses later, and this is God tells Noah, you must bring 7 pairs of all of the ritually clean animals. Basically the animals that would be kosher. And 1 pair of every unclean animal. So there's different instructions. This is more evidence of the 2 sources, right? So we can see that pretty clearly. I think it's worth pointing out that the editors of Genesis would have noticed this, right? So this can be problematic for us in the 21st century, sort of post-Enlightenment people. This is problematic for us. It obviously was not problematic for the ancient Hebrews who would have noticed this. I don't think they read it through and was like, yeah, that's all consistent. I mean, they're within a couple of verses of each other. So I think that's it's important for us to remember that when we look at these ancient texts, we have different values sometimes than the writers do. Yes? Mm-hmm.
They use the word son of God and sons and daughters of God. Son of God. And is that not right there? Or is that other word?
Okay, so I don't have a Bible out right now. So which... Right. Yeah, so I think... So that's part of the J source, the Yahweh source. That would be why it says the Lord. And the sons of the daughters of God are the Nephilim that we talked about. That's the word that's used in some of the texts. The idea of the ancient, of the some kind of heavenly or otherworldly beings. That's what that is. It's in the same J story. So the first version with the 2 pairs of with 1 pair of every animal, that is the priestly version. And the second is the J source, the Yahweh source, which is the same one that also talked about the Nephilim at the beginning of chapter 6. I think we should talk a little bit about why is there this difference. And I think the interesting part about this text is that it's actually, again, this is where it's a little different than maybe what we would do if we were the editors of Genesis. It actually preserves an argument in the text. And we're going to see this a lot in the Hebrew Scriptures. That was not an uncomfortable thing for ancient Hebrews to preserve an argument in the text. There's dialogue in the text. And so there's a disagreement between these 2 sources. And the editors decided to put both in. And that's going to be a theme throughout our studies of the Old Testament. So the J source includes extra animals so that Noah's family could make sacrifices to God, which we see in the story. There's sacrifices. and so that the family could eat meat. So there's obvious reasons for why you would want to include more animals if you're going to do that, right? If you were planning either practice, to eat animals or to sacrifice animals to God, you needed to have more than one pair, or else there would be no procreation, right? So the priestly source disagrees with this. Not with that, I mean, that's just kind of science, but disagrees with the number. Because according to the priestly source, the institution of the sacrificial system does not trace back to Noah. It traces back to Moses in the giving of the law. So the priestly source would not put in a sacrifice back in the time of the flood, because that source is saying, no, sacrifices began with Moses in the giving of the law. So did the idea of what was unclean and clean. That's when that came to us, not back in Noah's time. The J source disagrees with that and says, no, I'm tracing it back to Noah. Right? So there's a disagreement in the text between these two sources, and they're both kept in. Also, in the priestly source, eating animals doesn't happen until after the flood. So if having 7 pairs would give some wiggle room on the ark to eat animals, the priestly source would say, no, this happened after the flood. In a sense, I think, is suggesting it's a concession. That in the beginning, in the priestly story of creation, the people were only permitted to eat grass or plants or wheat or barley. And then are told after the flood, you can eat meat, and there's some restrictions around that, like not with the blood and things like that. You can eat animals, but from now on, animals are going to be afraid of you. Right? So we see that in this Noah story. And they're permitted then, in the priestly source, that would be the beginning of humans eating animals. So again, there's origin stories here, but there's some disagreements in the numbers and the reasons here in this story. So one more question. I don't know how much time we have because I'm live and it's not giving me a clock. How are we doing on time? Is it 7 right now? All right. Oh, it's past 7. With your permission, can I just run this last question really quickly? Does the flood achieve its purpose of changing the wickedness of humankind? So I received this question. In the bottom corner, it said no. So I feel like maybe we already have an answer to that. But so it does seem that the answer is no, and that God recognizes this after the flood even. So even after the flood and after all of this happens, God recognizes the human mind is still evil. However, I'm going to live with it. Right? So that's part of the promise. So all these people got wiped out. It didn't wipe out the same problem that was at the beginning. And so now I'm going to have to learn how to live with this. So, but I would suggest that if we can live with this answer, at least in the text, it suggests that it changes God in some way. And that God makes a promise to God's self, not to Noah or to anyone else. In chapter 8, it says God was thinking this, to never again destroy. So God says, it's still the same way, but I'm not going to destroy anymore. And then enters into a covenant with creation. Essentially, God decides that because humankind will inevitably fail, God decides, I'm going to stick with them. I can't just leave these people to their own devices. I see how that turns out. So I'm going to stick with them. And in that sense, it sort of sets the course of salvation history, that God always sticks with us. Even though, according to Genesis, God knows that we're going to still mess it up. And then there's another change, and I think this is really significant in the Noah story. And it's like right in front of our faces, but I think it's easy to miss. God hangs up the bow, right? So we know this part of the story. So we think about this when we see rainbows, right? We see rainbows. And that's true enough. But the text doesn't say rainbow or any other kind of weather event. It says bow. And I think it means bow, as in bow and arrow, as in a weapon of a warrior god, that God hangs that up. And because God hangs up this symbol of violence, it then becomes a symbol of the covenant. That's the reminder. And what I think is really, really important about this, in the text says this, and it's so easy to miss, but the text actually says this. The symbol is not a reminder for us that God has done this. It's not a reminder for people. The symbol is a reminder for God. Right? So if you look in the text, God says, I'm going to hang this bow up, and when I see it, I'll remember to never do this again. It's a reminder to God of the covenant that God makes with all of creation. That God decides, no longer a warrior God, I'm going to be in relationship with creation. I think that's really important. And if you have a takeaway of the Noah story, I hope that's it. So we're going to end there because we're over time. Next week we're going to read chapters 10 and 11. 10 and 11. It's the bridge between the flood and Abraham. And then we're going to get into the story of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. It's full of names. I'm just going to warn you that now. And next week, because it's so full of names, we'll just have a pop quiz and I'll have you all take turns standing up and saying names, which I think will be a lot of fun. Thank you all for being here tonight. Very good. Yeah, I would definitely do that.